Before her death, Rue McClanahan left behind something that most fans of the Golden Girls were never quite prepared to hear. Not a scandal, not betrayal, but something quieter and in many ways more unsettling than either of those things. She told the truth. Not the kind of truth that destroys a legacy, but the kind that reframes it entirely. The kind that makes you look back at everything you loved about a show and realize that what you were seeing was never exactly what you thought it was. And once you understand what Rue actually revealed, the show itself becomes something far more impressive, because what those four women pulled off every single week was not the result of deep friendship or natural chemistry. It was a result of something far more controlled, far more deliberate, and in Rue's own words, far more complicated than any audience ever realized. To understand what Rue revealed, you have to start with what most people believed. When the Golden Girls premiered and quickly became one of the most beloved sitcoms in television history, audiences latched onto a very specific idea, that these four women, Dorothy, Rose, Blanche, and Sophia, were not just characters who loved each other on screen, but that the actresses behind them shared something equally real off it. The warmth felt genuine. The laughter felt unscripted. The timing felt like it could only come from people who truly knew and trusted one another on a deeply personal level. That was the story people told themselves, and for years, nobody from the inside did very much to challenge it. The most significant tension Rue described, and the one she returned to most honestly, was the relationship between B. Arthur and Betty White. She never used the word hatred. She never framed it as some kind of war, but she also never softened it into something comfortable. What she described was a persistent, unspoken distance between two very different women who never found a natural connection despite spending years working beside each other. B came from a theater background where focus and control were treated as non-negotiable. She expected discipline at all times, even between takes, and she had little patience for anything that disrupted the rhythm she was trying to maintain. Betty, shaped by years in television and game shows, naturally gravitated toward lightness. She would talk to the studio audience during breaks, keep the energy playful, and find humor in the spaces between scenes. To B, that behavior was a distraction. To Betty, it was simply part of how television worked. Rue watched this dynamic closely and understood both sides of it. She respected BEA's commitment to craft and recognized that her discipline was a major reason the show functioned at the level it did. She also appreciated Betty's ability to keep the atmosphere from becoming too rigid. But what struck her most was how this tension never once made it onto the screen. Audiences watching Dorothy and Rose had no idea that the women behind those characters were navigating a relationship that was, at best, professionally cordial and, at other times, quietly strained. They sat together at meals. They maintained routines that from the outside looked like friendship. But Rue was honest about the fact that much of that was habit and structure rather than genuine warmth. Then came the awards, and with them, a layer of complexity that Rue described as subtle but impossible to ignore. Year after year, these four women were placed in direct competition with one another by an industry that had no interest in how that might affect the group. Betty White received recognition early, winning in the show's very first season. Rue herself would go on to win later. B. Arthur received her moment as well. Estelle Getty, whose performance as Sophia was arguably the most technically demanding of all for given that she was playing a woman older than her actual age, was nominated repeatedly before finally receiving her win. What Rue described in the aftermath of these moments was not open resentment or dramatic confrontation. It was something quieter and in some ways harder to navigate. Congratulations that felt restrained. Energy that didn't always carry back into the working environment the following day. A kind of careful, unspoken awareness that recognition within the group was something to be managed rather than simply celebrated. She was careful to say that none of this ever damaged the performances. The show continued to deliver at an extraordinary level regardless of what was happening beneath the surface. But Rue wanted people to understand that the ease they were watching on screen was not evidence that everything behind it was equally easy. It was evidence of how completely these women understood the responsibility they shared and how seriously each of them took it, even when the personal dynamics were anything but simple. The moment that perhaps defined everything most clearly came near the end of the show's run, when B. Arthur made a decision that none of the others were prepared for. Rue described it without bitterness, but with complete honesty. They had reached a point where the work no longer challenged her the way it once had. She felt the show had accomplished what it set out to do, that the writing was no longer offering her the same creative space it once had, and that continuing would mean going through motions she was no longer willing to go through. So she walked away. Her refusal was direct and final, and it left the rest of the cast and production in a position where they had to figure out what came next without one of the central figures the show was built around. Rue, Betty, and Estelle were all prepared to continue. They wanted to keep going. But without Dorothy, the show as it existed could not survive, and everyone involved understood that. The result was an ending that preserved the original series rather than allowing it to stretch beyond what it could sustain, and a spin-off that carried 3 of the 4 actresses into a new setting. Rue transitioned into that next chapter without hesitation, but she was honest about what it felt like. The absence of B. Arthur created a structural gap that couldn't be filled, not because no one tried, but because what B had brought to every scene was not replaceable. The spin-off found its own audience, but it was never quite the same thing, and Rue knew that even as she was making it. What she left behind in her reflections was not a story of 4 women who secretly despise one another or a behind-the-scenes world filled with drama and backstabbing. It was something more nuanced and, in its own way, more remarkable. She described 4 highly skilled, deeply experienced women who found a way to create something extraordinary together without needing to be close, without needing to share their lives outside the studio, and without needing their personal feelings about one another to align with what they were building on screen. That, Rue believed, was the real achievement. Not that they loved each other the way their characters did, but that they respected each other's abilities enough to show up every day and do the work regardless of what existed outside the frame. She talked about the discipline it required, the trust in each other's timing, the awareness of how to support a scene without overtaking it, and the shared commitment to never letting the audience see anything other than what the script intended. She talked about how comedy of that kind demands a level of precision that most people don't recognize as the technical skill it actually is. And she talked about how that precision, more than anything else, was what made the show work at the level it did. Not warmth, not friendship, precision. The audience interpreted what they saw as something deeply personal, and Rue understood why. What those 4 women created on screen looked like love, looked like years of shared history and genuine affection, looked like exactly the kind of bond that the show was built around celebrating. But behind it was something different, something more controlled, more deliberate, and in many ways more impressive, because it meant that every moment of warmth audiences felt from the screen was earned through craft rather than simply captured from life. Before she died, Rue McClanahan made sure that story was told, not to diminish what the Golden Girls was or take anything away from the love people have carried for it across decades, but to be honest about what it actually took to make it. For women who were not always comfortable with one another, who competed against each other for industry recognition, who had fundamentally different approaches to their work, and who navigated real tension across 7 seasons, managing all of it carefully enough that none of it ever touched the performances. That is what Rue wanted people to understand. And when you watch the show knowing that what you see on screen stops feeling like a lucky accident and starts feeling like exactly what it was, one of the most disciplined, committed, and quietly extraordinary professional achievements in the history of American television,